Hi everyone, Big Thinny Puke Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of this new Algiers album, Shook. This is the fourth full-length LP from radical Georgia rockers Algiers, one of my favorite bands to break out of the 2010s. These guys brought a unique blend of blues, goth-tinged gospel, and post-punk that resulted in two of the most underappreciated albums of the past decade in my opinion. Then there was their third record, There Is No Year, which for sure is more interesting than most stuff out there these days, but it was still their weakest effort yet in my opinion. Was it due to stagnance, or maybe the band trying to streamline their sound to make it more accessible? I'm not entirely sure. Either way, it led to an album with fewer bold instrumentals, highlights, and surprises. But now in 2023 we have a follow-up with Shook, where I think Algiers is kind of taking the opposite approach this time around. The band is getting even wilder and more ambitious with their genre fusions now, though I think their plan to do that was already made clear with teasers featuring guest rap verses from Billy Woods, Backwash, and Rage Against the Machine's Zach De La Rocha. Shook also doesn't hesitate to dive further into more analog synthesizers, sequenced electronic beats, so the band is bringing even more sounds and ideas into their already eclectic mix of everything, so the question really is, does it pay off? And for me, that's difficult to say. While Shook is definitely not all bangers, I can respect that this is likely going to be the most unruly album Algiers will ever release, because the track list on this thing is a bumpy white water raft adventure of surprise guests, weird musical sidebars, interludes, anthems, odysseys, and harebrained ideas. To call the flow of this thing choppy would be a bit of an understatement. One thing about this record is super clear though, and that's Algiers' political leanings, which they expel pretty creatively throughout this album, through some of the guest spots, through phone recordings, through poetry. The spoken word appearance from Atlanta legend Big Rube makes for quite the album tone setter on the intro track. So there's that, there's the messaging, but everything else about the album in terms of style, structure, song quality is a bit more of a crapshoot. Now, here and there, this volatility does lead to some highlights. We have Irreversible Damage with Zach De La Rocha, who I mentioned earlier, which features some intensely twittering beats, murderously sour chord changes, some hellish layers of guitars and howling vocals too. Frontman Franklin James Fisher has one of the most fiery and dynamic vocal performances on any Algiers song, with a seamless mix of singing, shouting, and rapping that makes way more sense than it should. Zach's appearance is solid per usual, and there's an explosive ending on the track that's fantastic too. Deeper into the record, we also have the punk rager A Good Man, the haunting and soulful I Can't Stand It featuring Sam T. Herring of Future Islands fame. Then there's also the grim rock anthem Cold World, which has some pretty cool industrial undertones to it. The aggressive vocal chants on this one make it a highlight, along with the unique vocal performance from Egyptian artist Nada El Shazly. 73% is another favorite on the record. It is a groovy piece of art punk with a lot of spoken word passages laced into it. It's a pretty dense song that says a lot, but ultimately it boils down to society's willingness to blame each other, blame the powerless, blame the marginalized for the problems in the world we live in, as opposed to the ruling class or those in power who are actually like in charge of fixing these things. So yeah, I love those tracks on the LP, but the rest of the album more or less leaves me cold or scratching my head for a variety of different reasons. There are some tracks that have a severe lack of development to them, most notably Cleanse Your Guilt Here, whose moody vocals and looping soul chops have potential to them that isn't fully explored. There's Bite Back with Billy Woods and Backwash, which I wasn't really crazy about as a single. I'm still sort of on the fence with it, mostly because it does feel like a hodgepodge of different passages and ideas. Also, Fisher's rap verse in the middle of the track is not really all that well done. Like, there's clearly a gap in quality in terms of flow and energy going on here when it's sandwiched in between Billy Woods and Backwash. Plus, there's a few awkward musical transitions from the start to the finish of the cut too. Because the track, while yes, it does present a lot within the 6 minutes it lasts, the end result isn't really all that potent. It comes across more disjointed than cohesive, but I suppose the ending is still pretty strong. There are also cuts on this thing like an Echophonic Soul or Out of Style Tragedy, which more or less are spoken word pieces, which I could really take or leave, especially since the poetry kind of melts into the dense instrumentals here and doesn't really keep me on the edge of my seat. These songs come across like filler. Filler I would like to look past, but they take up so much real estate in the album's runtime. Because sadly, on this almost hour-long album, Algiers does sink a lot of effort into these bridges to nowhere, or tracks that I think are half-baked but somehow go on forever, like the song Green Iris, which might be my least favorite here, which features some very over-the-top gospel harmony layers, some minimal hand claps, very, very, very tense jazz chord changes too, and all of it really just feels like a mismatch, honestly. Especially when you take into account the very aggressive shift into louder instrumentation and electronic beats at the very end, which kind of comes across like too little too late, which I also felt on the song Something Wrong, which in concept is a really promising rock cut about an exchange that you would have with an officer as you're just being pulled over. Given that it's an Algiers album, I think we know how this is going to play out. And rather than just letting the commentary on this track be what it's going to be and see whether or not it just kind of stands on the merit of however it's performed or pulled off, Algiers decides to just slow the whole track down and just throw the pitch off and soak what's left in dubby effects and droning synthesizers. Now, I do like that the tempo picks back up at the very finish, which is very vengeful, but the journey to get to that point is very long and very obnoxious. I don't really have much else to say about this record other than it's kind of odd to be at this point, because Algiers really did hit us with a very different album this time around. And despite that, I somehow don't feel that much stronger about it than I did There Is No Year. Because for sure, there are some solid songs on the album here and there, but quite a few tracks on this thing are dedicated to fragments and underdeveloped ideas. So while Shook is certainly adventurous, it's also really unfocused in a way. Now, ultimately, I can't say I'm really surprised by this change and this level of experimentation from Algiers. We are talking about the band that dropped Can the Sub Bass Speak, a jazz poetry sound collage, which, if you remember, was like the first single from their last album cycle. The track didn't even end up making it onto the album, but given the tone and style of that track, I was expecting more songs like that to end up on that LP. Now, finally, we have Shook, and there are multiple tracks here that I would say are more along the lines of that single, stylistically. And in a way, this album embodies that energy in totality. It is a chaotic collage of ideas and sounds and styles and structures and approaches, which just thrives on its messaging and its rebellion against being neatly categorized. While I think Algiers' rebellious attitude have served them well in the past, it led to a lack of musical coherence and cohesion this time around, in my opinion. I'm feeling a decent 2 strong 6 on this one. Transition, have you given this album a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head, it's another video you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Algiers, forever.